Welcome to the Pen Leader Podcast, where strategic leaders get straight to the topics, strengthening our awareness and sharpening our minds. The Pen Leader Podcast is produced by Roar, a production division of Mays & Associates Ltd. Find out more at www.maysassociatesltd.com. Now here is your award-winning host, Dr. Shanda Gore.
And welcome back to the Pen Leader Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the business of better care. And I have with me Mr. Arturo Polizzi, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer at ProMedica, a mission-driven, not-for-profit health and well-being organization headquartered in Toledo, Ohio. In his role, he provides strategic vision, leadership, and oversight as the organization advances its mission to improve health and the well-being in the communities it serves. He's also served in very strategic and operational roles at ProMedica, including Associate General Counsel, Chief Human Resources Officer, President of the Metro Toledo ProMedica Hospitals, and President and Chief Operating Officer. In former position outside of ProMedica, Mr. Polizzi also served as the President and CEO at Christ Hospital Health Network in Cincinnati, Ohio. Mr. Polizzi holds a Bachelor of Science degree in business from Miami University, a Juris Doctorate from the University of Toledo College of Law, and a Master of Business Administration from the University of Michigan. I'm so glad to have him in studio with me. Hello, Arturo.
Hi there. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
Excellent. So we're going to get right into it. And I'm going to ask you, the first thing is, what leadership means to you and in the context of a very large, complex health system like ProMedica.
Yeah, I think that setup is really good. Healthcare is really complex these days, especially. And we are a big organization. We're close to 20,000 employees. And so for me, leadership really is more about setting macro vision, setting the right direction, communicating it really well to different audiences inside the organization, and getting buy-in on that vision and making sure you have the right team in place to execute on the vision. When you get to a certain size of an organization, true leadership versus management becomes a really important distinction. So when I think about leadership in my role, I do my best not to micromanage anything.
Of course not.
And it's critical, I think, to lead with transparency. Mm-hmm. And, you have different audiences. It's one thing to communicate to your board. It's another thing to communicate to the frontline employees. It's a similar message, but they're nuanced. And how you articulate a strategy and a vision to your board versus your frontline might be a little nuanced. So when I think about my role and how I think about leadership, it's that. It's having that right vision, communicating it with transparency, and then really importantly, making sure you have the right people in place to make it happen. That's a really big part of, I believe, my role is to making sure not only we have the right people, but I'm doing my job to make sure they have what they need to be successful.
Mm-hmm. We talk a lot about how that culture that individuals can actually be able to lead within an organization that has that ability to allow them to do it, how very important it is. In recent years, there's been a number of events that have created certain dynamics, both from externally, that actually impacts internally. Can you talk about how that may have reshaped how you lead?
So yeah, we've been through the mill. Last few years, coming out of the pandemic, it really was a perfect storm for our organization in a bad way. On top of the pandemic and all the operational issues that it brought, on top of that, we had a financial crisis. So we really had to dig deep and figure out how we were going to restructure the organization and get ourselves out of it. When I look back, at how I was leading then versus how I'm leading now we're stable. The restructuring plan worked, and it's a different day, a different environment in which we're working. The word that comes to mind for me is adaptability. Mm-hmm. You have to adapt to the circumstances. When we were in crisis, it's not my nature to be very autocratic, but I was much more autocratic, still trying to be collaborative, still trying to be consensus building. But at the end of the day, we had to make quick decisions, and they were on my shoulders to make. And so we made them, and we moved on. I did try to make sure I was communicating the why behind the decisions, because we did some tough things. We divested a lot of businesses, which, were tough to do. But so long as I was able to communicate the why, I found people understood and followed along. So it was a little more top down than my typical style would be. Now that we're more stable, I do view leadership more through a collaborative lens, a more servant leader. Like I was saying earlier, getting the right people in place and making sure they have what they need to get their jobs done. At the end of the day, healthcare, I'm not a clinical provider. Our job in administration and leadership is to make sure our caregivers have what they need to care for our patients. At the end of the day, that's our number one, and what we all have to be really focused on. It's really important. Healthcare is a very noble profession. When I see those caregivers and I meet with the frontline people, it gives me energy, because it makes me want to do my job better so that they have what they need to keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of stress too. I mean, that front line, seeing the worst sometimes circumstances is not always a happy time when you're going to the hospital, that's for sure. And then being able to give that service at the top level to make sure that everybody is getting the best health care they can. So it is very much so. I also know that, again, when you talk about culture and you talk about individuals and servant leadership, so very important in how that changed. This whole piece about being under pressure, what do you see? What do you advise leaders that are out there? They may not be overseeing 20,000 employees, but they may be in a situation where they are faced with a turning point within their organization and they have to perhaps change how they lead, which we talk about pivoting. What advice would you give to anyone about when you can see that pivot having to happen?
At its core, I would say to have empathy. Mm-hmm. In order to communicate really well and in order to be transparent, which I think are critical when you're pivoting, you have to be empathetic to the people who are going to be impacted by the change you're looking to make. I don't think you can communicate really well unless you have that empathy, which means you have to get face-to-face as much as you can, eyeball to eyeball with the frontline folks to explain what you're doing and why. That's really difficult when you have 20,000 people, So I started doing selfie videos in my office. I did them by myself, scripted them myself, and every few weeks. And I found that to be really helpful. But before I did them, I would talk to people. I would say, what are you worried about? What do you want me to address? What can we do better communicating with you about? As I learned, I was empathetic to their concerns, their stressors, and I tried to address them. And even if I didn't have a good answer, I would say it. I would say, I don't know what we're going to do about this yet, but we're going to work on it. We're going to come up with a plan, and then we're going to communicate it back to you. So I think that empathy piece is really, really important for leaders. It's one thing to be super smart, but if you're not empathetic, you're not going to have an ability to communicate and bring people along with you on the journey.
I agree. I was just talking with someone just a few days ago, and we were talking about people leave people, not so much jobs. They may love their job and their role, but if they don't think that leadership cares and they're not empathic to where they are, it's hard to get behind and feel the passion of moving a goal or an action item forward, because especially if they don't know what part they're playing on that bus.
Absolutely
right?
True. 100%. You said it better than I did.
Well, thank you. Across a number of industries, we're not just talking about healthcare. It really is across all of these industries. It applies, and it's amazing how you can recruit and retain great workforce by just taking the time to be with them. So I'm glad you did those snippets. So here's a question. You talk about reading over with ProMedica's mission and values and guiding your decision-making at the leadership level. How do you see that? Because, again, you've been with ProMedica for a number of years. You started off your careers as a general counsel, and looking back on that and where you are now, can you talk about that and the mission and how that drives you?
Yeah, it's always core to ProMedica, a mission-based organization. Our mission is to improve health and well-being in our community. And as a nonprofit, we don't answer to shareholders. We have a community board who volunteer their time to make sure we're doing the right things by way of the community. And it absolutely drives our strategic discussions, as do our values. Compassion, innovation, teamwork, excellence, and learning. We can't function consistently without focus on that mission and on those values. You know, a lot of the restructuring we did when we were making decisions about what we were going to keep and what we were going to divest came down to focus of who we are and that mission that started at the Toledo Hospital 150 years ago. As we evolved into who we are now, the mission has remained the same. And I think sometimes organizations get a little away from that mission and you get into different stuff and you kind of lose sight of it. Crisis makes you focus right back onto why are we here and what do we do really well. That mission and those values really do play a critical role inside of our organization.
Mm-hmm. I do a lot of coaching and I talk to organizations. They may have a strategic plan in their heads, but it needs to be written out. It's also the same with the mission and the vision of the organization. If you don't come back to your mission and know and focus on that, and that everybody who's part of the organization understands the mission, it will fall apart. Or new missions pop up. And then it becomes where you've got people rowing in different direction, right?
Yes.
And we all know when you start rowing different, you wind up going in a circle. And that's not where you want. You want to go straight forward. So, yes, I commend you for that and focusing on that. Now, I know one of the pieces that I see coming up, and I know it is a big concern for a number of leaders that have talked with me, and I've seen, and there's a lot of research going on right now about the impact of AI. And I was going to see what you thought about the impact of AI, the new technologies, and what you see that it might make in the healthcare field.
Yeah, we're seeing it already. We've got at ProMedica over 100 applications today that's running AI. I'll give you a couple examples. We have it both in the clinical space and non-clinical space. So in the clinical space, an area I'd give you an example on would be diagnostics. So say you have an X-ray or a CAT scan or an MRI. There's AI now that'll give you the initial read. So when the physician looks at the scan and the test, he or she can see what AI is telling them and either validate it or not. But it helps. So it's not replacing jobs right now in healthcare. It's really helping people do their jobs. Same on the non-clinical side. You know, one of the biggest threats to healthcare these days are cyber attacks. Mm-hmm. We have AI systems running in the background of our IT systems looking for trouble all the time. So AI is helping us look for trouble from hackers. And it's terrifying what's going on out there from a cyber perspective. So getting really sophisticated, because that's how the hackers are trying to get in, is with their AI. Now we've got AI trying to block them. It's a crazy world we're living in these days. But those are a couple of examples. I would say over time, I'm really excited about where AI is going to take us. We're being a little cautious at ProMedica about, adopting every one of the latest and greatest AI tools that are coming out. Everyone's coming to my door every day telling me they're going to solve all of my problems with AI. We're trying to be incremental movers. We're not going to be bleeding edge, but we're also not going to be lagging behind. We're trying to incrementally every day look at things that are becoming more and more proven in the AI space in healthcare and then adopting them as they come along. So it's exciting. It's a little scary, but it's exciting. I think the prospects and the improvements in healthcare are going to be pretty significant over the next decade or so.
Mm-hmm. I will say this. My most effective leaders are definitely embracing it as in a cautionary tale, because they're working very closely with their IT departments to make sure there's, because AI some of it can open you up in the back end. And so making sure policies are in place. And for those listeners out there, they hear me hyping the policy is so critically important because there's confusion on frontline on like, when do I use it and when don't I use it? And when I say that, there's Copilot that's out there. And like, if I rewrite this sentence or if I allow it, is that going to be okay? And I always say this, just know human is first. That human connection is so critically important, and that check the tone. Even if you have AI writing your emails, check the tone to make sure it's your tone. It's what your voice is. And to make sure the information is correct. I had individuals ask me, what AI, yes, it does hallucinate. It has gaps in it. So don't rely totally on it. Critical thinking is going to be really a big part. I just sat on a symposium where I talked about this critical thinking, asking critical questions to get it to work where you need it to be. And so that's encouraging. I'm glad to hear that you are starting to get that adoption going on, and that you have so many that your workforce are exploring. Efficiency, yes, it can be very efficient. It saves time. So for those that are leaders out there who are saying, no, I don't want to use it. I've got one leader who told me if he can get away until he retires not using it, he's going to be happy. And I said, no, help with your next generation for your succession planning. And, I do remember when the internet came out, people were afraid the internet was going to replace all the libraries. I don't know if you remember that or not.
I do.
And I'm like, we still have libraries. We still do. And they pivoted. So I think that's really important to know and understand. So excellent.
One thing I love about what you said about checking the tone, I do think from a leadership perspective, you have to be really careful about that. Going back to something I said earlier, you're not going to look very empathic if AI is doing your communicating. You're not going to be authentic. Again, it shouldn't replace you. It should help you. So I think we as leaders are going to have to resist the urge to turn over and abdicate all of our communication to these tools, because I do think you lose the human factor, and then you start to lose connection with your people. So it's going to be interesting to see how this evolves.
Yes, I do. I talk about the 3 C's: communication, which you touched base on. I do think about care within the communication, and there's that connection that you're talking about, and then how that creates really civility across the board. So if there's misunderstandings, you can always go back to care and communications.
I like it. Yeah, that's great.
So excellent. So now it's my fun questions. What are you reading and what are you watching?
When I read, those are good questions. I usually read leadership stuff. So right now I'm rereading, actually, The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek.
Okay.
I really love the book, and it goes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier. It talks about businesses not as finite institutions, but infinite institutions, and it really challenges you to think long-term about your mission and your why. He's got another book that's something to the effect of, what's your why?
Why? Yes, that's the one I know.
Yeah. So The Infinite Game is really good. It talks about businesses, unlike he uses an analogy, like it's not a football game where it's just going to end. You need to be thinking about your business over a very long term, not short term shareholder desires, but more long term sustainability. And if you have that long vision, it allows you to stay focused on your mission and evolve the strategy versus having really short-term strategies that might not be good for the long term, sacrificing, the future for short-term gains. So it's a really good book. I'm rereading it because it brings me home to kind of why or how I need to communicate things, how I need to be thinking about our business.
Mm-hmm. Are you watching anything, or do you have time to watch anything?
I do, and this is embarrassing, but I'm watching probably for the 10th time The Sopranos. I love The Sopranos.
Okay.
So I'm rewatching that. What else am I watching? I really enjoyed the prequel to Yellowstone, those time period pieces, 1883.
Yes.
I really enjoyed that. I watched that one recently, and my wife and I watch a lot of cops and robbers kind of shows on TV.
Cops and robbers.
Yeah.
Yes, I was. My husband and I was sharing that we're caught up in Love Boat right now. We're in season 5 of Love Boat, and it's
the original one.
The original Love
Wow.
Boat. I'm a classic television
Wow, I guess
watcher. So yes, well, and Murder, She Wrote.
There you go.
I go to bed on Murder, She Wrote, too. So I get it. I think there's something said about something that's totally removed from you, right?
Yes.
And right now, a cruise is totally removed from me.
Yes. That's hysterical.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time and sharing that, and especially how you see the leadership. And hopefully those that are listening are getting some good nuggets of information about what they can do in their workplace.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you to our listeners. We really appreciate your time and your feedback. We appreciate if you would give us additional feedback at info@mazeassociatesltd.com. We'd also like to thank our sponsor, Realtor Shannon Roof of Berkshire Hathaway Home Services Kohler Realty, educating clients so they feel confident in their decisions and at the closing table. And don't forget to pick up a copy of the #1 HR Personnel Management new release on Amazon, The Pen Leader Path: Identify, Engage, and Develop Effective Human and AI Leadership for Your Organizational Culture. You can find it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, and wherever books are sold. And of course, until next time.
The Pen Leader Podcast is hosted by Dr. Shanda Gore and brought to you by Maze & Associates Ltd, creating customized solutions for growth in the areas of leadership development, strategic planning, and culture building. Find out more at www.mazeassociatesltd.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the Pen Leader Podcast and share with others.